It's nice to welcome. Let me see. Good afternoon. It's nice to welcome everyone. I appreciate your attendance. We're going to get started just a little bit early because our governor has business to attend to, and we don't want to stand in the way. Dr. Heckman is here, and he's working to get his presentation ready for you. And I will move us along here, and again, welcome. I'm Kathy Grace, and along with Dr. Melody Musgrove, we would like to welcome you. As co-directors for the Graduate Center for the Study of Early Learning, we consider today as the beginning of a very interesting and hopefully productive discussion focusing on the future of those who call Mississippi home. Before I introduce Governor Bryant, who will officially welcome us, I would like to acknowledge former Governor Ronnie Musgrove and other elected officials who may be in attendance. It is my honor to introduce the 64th Governor of the state of Mississippi, Governor Phil Bryant. Governor Bryant has championed education since his first term. His leadership has been evident in that we have now increased our graduation rate up to 80%, and as of this year, over 90% of third graders have passed the third grade literacy examination. In addition, during his administration, the Early Learning Collaborative Act of 2013 was passed, resulting in state funds being appropriated to be combined with local dollars to implement high-quality pre-kindergarten programs in now 14 communities across the state. And in 2014, a $100 million teacher pay raise was passed. Those outside of Mississippi have recognized Governor Bryant's commitment to education, as he is the chairman of Jobs for America's Grads, a program that helps at-risk high school students graduate across the nation. He also serves as chairman of the Education Commission of the States, a nonpartisan group that helps governors, state legislators, and state educated officials develop policies at the state level and to improve the quality of education. Following the governor's welcome, Dr. Rhea Williams Bishop, director of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation in Mississippi and New Orleans programs, will introduce Dr. Heckman. We'll have time to ask questions at the conclusion of Dr. Heckman's address and encourage you to make notes or formulate a question on the cards you were given if you do not wish to speak at the mic, and we will have people to collect those cards. So, Governor Bryant, thank you very much for attending with us today, and going to let you officially welcome us.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. Good afternoon. Now, those of you that may be in and around Jackson know this time of year, I know the governor does, Governor Musgrove, that the legislature is in session. In fact, the House went into session at 2 o'clock this afternoon. I think it was Daniel Webster that said, "Men still toil in the fields, while women weep softly in their kitchens. For the legislature's in session and no man's property is safe." Apparently, Mr. Webster had a little difficulty with the legislature and some tax issues, I think. But welcome to, I think, one of the finest museums in the United States. Now, there are two museums, one of Mississippi's history and one of the Civil Rights Museums. I hope and I know you will take the opportunity to see them before you leave here, because they are spectacular. We were open here on December the 9th. Mississippi's birthday was December the 10th, our bicentennial. Mine was the 9th of December. It just happened to fall on that particular day that we celebrated with millions of people that watched all around the world as the opening of these great facilities occurred. I'm particularly glad that you're here today to talk about early childhood education, because we learn more about it almost on a weekly basis. I think what we will hear today from Dr. Heckman will be enlightening, but it is part of what we have, and we in my office or at the Education Commission of the States, which I now chair. As chairman of Jobs for American Graduates for 3 years, we've helped over 1 million at-risk children. 95% of the times when JAG involves themselves with an at-risk child, they graduate from high school. Almost 80% of the time there's a positive outcome. They get a job, or they go on to a community college, or they go on to institutions of higher learning. It has been some of the best work of my life. now that we are with the Education Commission of the states and identifying early childhood learning is our top agenda item for this year. One of the items that we were looking at is a program that was completed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's called Workforce of Today, Workforce of Tomorrow. Go online, get this document, and read it. It is amazing how it describes in great detail the inefficiency that we have had in our child care centers. Not all of them. So we have to be very careful. There are some tremendous child care centers out across Mississippi and out across America. My children went to Dominicare at St. Dominic's Hospital, where my wife was an employee for 38 years. She started there when she was 15. 38 years later, she retired. Our two children grown, but they had the soft skills that they need because the nuns ran that daycare at St. Dominic's. So they came out knowing their letters, some of their math, and the Lord's Prayer. They knew the soft skills that were so necessary for their success in life had to be taught at that age from birth to 5 years of age. Conflict resolution. Yes, someone has to be taught conflict resolution. You have to be taught how to put a team together for solving even the simplest of problems. And when we are learning as rapidly as we are at any other time in our life is when those children are in those daycare centers. About 98% of the children across the state of Mississippi that are of that age from birth to about 4 years old are in some type of daycare or custodial center. So we realize after reading this that the workforce of the future are in today's child care centers. And the number one reason their parents, a lot of them being single mothers, are not working is because they can't afford or don't have adequate opportunity to take their children to a daycare center. Now, we spend $98 million a year, $98 million a year on federally funded daycare. That's a lot of money where I come from. Now, what we have decided we need to do is not only there in those federally funded daycare centers, but all daycare centers, is try to find that continuum of learning. So put a learning component into the daycare centers. You know, we've talked for years of how do we teach these children literally from birth until they go into a pre-K program. Well, we thought about how you're going to put them on a school bus. Do you put bigger buildings out there with a public education system now? No, you go where they're at. We know where they're at. So we are going about training those daycare workers with our community colleges, funding through a program with the Department of Human Services, so that we are putting a learning component with those daycare workers. Now think about what we do. And this is no one's fault. It's just the societal trends occurred and brought us to this point. We oftentimes find a daycare worker that would be paid minimum wage. They're just not paid very much. We take our children and we put them there in that facility. We've got to do a better job. So we're starting now, and we're one of the few states to be able to do that. Just a few years ago, our CCAC, our State Early Childhood Advisory Council, began to look at the continuum of care for children in the state of Mississippi. And not only the children, but how do we work with the parents? Because the problems that are occurring in those daycare centers with those children oftentimes are brought from their home. It is difficult for us to realize, if you have not been there in a poor community, the struggles that these children are having. So how do we then work with the parents to make sure that the parents understand that there's federally funded daycare at $98 million a year that they have access to? Are we certain that the children are accessing the CHIPS program? Can we find a workforce training program for that mother? There's nothing wrong with trying to find a single mother in the Mississippi Delta, and I'm from Morehead, Mississippi, so I know a little bit about it. Nothing in the world wrong with trying to find a single mother and put her into a workforce training program. We want her to have a career, not just a job, but a career. We want her child to grow up and have that outcome of success that we see with our at-risk JAG students so that they're going on to a college of their choice. But we have found out, for example, that teen pregnancy helps greatly diminish those opportunities. If you're a 15-year-old girl in the Mississippi Delta in Holmes County, for example, and you have your first child at 15, the chances of you being very successful in life are greatly challenged. So we've worked to reduce teen pregnancy in the state of Mississippi. We have one of the largest reductions in teen pregnancy in the United States of America, about 25% last year. Yeah, unfortunately, as well, many of those teenagers continue to act like teenagers even when they're pregnant. So you don't have enough prenatal care. You don't know, perhaps late into that pregnancy, that she is pregnant. And so we have premature birth with the challenges that go along with all of that. So we've been working hard to try to reduce that, and we've been very successful at doing that. But the new idea, the new trend, and I believe we're starting here in Mississippi, I know we are because I've been invited to speak all over the nation about it, looking at the continuing of care for that child, realizing that there must be a learning component in daycare centers. Now look, good daycare centers, my daughter's an attorney. I had to adjust my lawyer jokes. But see, she can afford a good daycare. The daycare she was so worried about getting her children in, you have to get in line, you have to get on the list. So they're going to be fine. But you see, every child deserves that opportunity. Every child needs a learning, nurturing, safe environment in their daycare, not just in Rankin County or Madison County or on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, but in Sunflower and Holmes and Walthall counties. So we're working hard to make sure that that happens. We are very appreciative that you are here to help us continue that. Now, is there enough money to do everything we want to do? Not yet. Do we go every year and try to improve it? Absolutely. When I first met Dr. Lori Smith, she was working for the Barksdale Reading Institute. They came to my office as lieutenant governor, and we began to work on building blocks. It was our first effort. We continue to work on building blocks. Now the additional programs that we see are becoming so successful. We spend about $199 million a year on early childhood learning in the state of Mississippi. It's federally funded. It's called Head Start. You see, I knew she knew it. I should have called on y'all. Did you realize that we spend $199 million a year on the Head Start program? Now, I can tell you, we like outcomes. I want to see results. $199 million a year, we want to see some really good results in the Head Start program. And I will tell you, some are and many are not. But we've got to work on that program as well. We've come a long way, but a long way to go. Unemployment in Mississippi today is 4.6%. That's the lowest it's been since they've been recording unemployment. 70,000 new people have gone to work since 2011 when I came into office. A job is good for people. You live longer when you have a job. You can afford a home. You can afford to take care of your own children. You might be able to access health care with your employer. We now have over 40,000 job openings. You can go on to our app of Mississippi Works, 40,000 jobs that I need to fill. So we must have an educated workforce starting in our daycare at the earliest opportunities. And I know many of you here are working hard to do that. I'm headed to the legislature to see what good things have happened and what things I must be fretting over. So I want to thank y'all for being here, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to welcome you to Jackson, Mississippi here today. Thank you. Ed, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to look out and see all your beautiful faces. It's sort of like an early childhood business reunion, because I see faces from the business side of the house as well as the early childhood side of the house, and I'm excited about that and the opportunity to actually introduce such a distinguished scholar here today. In getting ready this morning, every morning we talk a little bit about our day, and so I say, what do you have going on today, honey? And he'll let me know, and I'll share with him. This morning was a little different, so I said, I've got to introduce Dr. Heckman today. And he paused. Now, he's a stockbroker, so keep this in mind. He paused and he said, "The James Heckman?" Federal Reserve James Heckman. So I have to give Dr. Heckman credit for allowing me to get some points with my husband, because I think this is the first time he's been that impressed with me rolling out what I'm doing in a particular day. So to get on with the formal introduction, I wanted to begin with a quote from Dr. Heckman, and I think it really will resonate with all of us. The goal, I think, of American education for decades and across many, many scholars was basically to teach people broad lessons in how to live life, how to engage life, and how to essentially be effective citizens and effective people in life. With that, I'll share with you that he is the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for the Economics of Human Development at the University of Chicago. He has devoted his professional life to understanding the origins of major social and economic questions that are related to critical issues such as inequality, social mobility, discrimination, and the formation of skills and regulation in labor markets. But in addition to that, he has also worked to devise and apply economically interpretable empirical strategies for understanding and addressing these many questions. Professor Heckman has published over 300 articles and 9 books on these topics. His awards are not only prestigious, but numerous. He is the recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, the John Bates Clark Medal, the Jacob Menser Award, the Dennis Agner Award, the Ulysses Medal, the Theodore W. Schultz Award, the Gold Medal of the President of the Italian Republic, the Fritz Medal, the Dan David Prize, and is also a Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association. Professor Heckman's research demonstrated a 13% return on investment for every dollar invested in high-quality early childhood development. His research has influenced over $1 billion. Let me repeat that, $1.5 billion in appropriations for early childhood education programs at both the state and the federal level. So before he comes to the podium, I'd like to share one last quote that captures, I think, the very essence of what he brings to us and why he is here today. In his words, "There is a responsibility that goes with winning the Nobel Prize, and the responsibility is that if you have a forum, you should use it wisely." So Professor Heckman, thank you for coming to Mississippi to share your wisdom and your knowledge. And so you all please help me in giving a warm round of applause to Dr. James J. Heckman as he comes forward.
Oh, here, I'm gonna set this up. Do you want this or you want your lavalier mic? We should turn this one off. I should probably use this, but I should turn the other one on. Now, yes, okay, I can speak. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a real opportunity and a pleasure for me to be here today and talk. Although the governor summarized a lot of relevant points, so I'm wondering if I'm just bringing coals to Newcastle, but I'll try to add to what he said. As was already explained in the introduction to this talk and to me, I've been working on human development for a long time, and I see human development as part of a general issue of economic development. And so today I really want to explain how human development is an important aspect of economic development and how we can actually imagine devising effective strategies for promoting economic development. And it will touch on some of the themes that were just sounded. So let me make sure I have access to, I can advance these slides here. I have a, This got stuck in my coat. Okay, here it is. Oops, well, so much for that. Okay, here, I can advance it manually. So we know that there are serious economic challenges, not just in Mississippi, but also around the country, around the world, actually. But in particular, we're going to talk about American issues. And I think the questions that are challenging us are serious. Economic inequality, questions about social mobility, how important economic family origins are. And we also know that the society is often very divided, politically, socially, culturally. And many times, when it comes to political discussions, there's a polarized leadership, and sometimes that gets in the way of actually addressing these problems in a kind of objective way. So today I want to try to present some evidence. I present evidence from a body of research with which I'm associated, but just not my own research as well from scholars in the general field of human development. So we know, just looking at Mississippi and comparing aspects, here I don't want to just focus on problems, but it's because I think we can address these problems. We know that in the United States, at least the official poverty rate is around 12%. And in 2017, at least by the U.S. Census measure, the poverty rate here in Mississippi was even higher, about 20%. And if anything, there's been a small decrease from 1990, but there has been actually an increase from the year 2000. But also, as was mentioned too, there are a lot of children in single-parent families, many of which are poor families. And this has a huge implication, as the governor again said, for the future not only of the mother, but also of the child. And so in devising effective policies, you want to keep these and other statistics in mind. So the way I want to address this question, and I think the most effective way, is to alleviate poverty and inequality by building skills. Skills are the coin of the realm. Skills are essential to the modern economy. And skills are not like a single dimension. It's not just IQ. It's not just how well you do on an achievement test or some kind of standard measure of school performance. But skills include a wide array of characteristics, and I'll explain those. A wide array of personality, social and emotional skills, health, and the ability to kind of manage one's emotions, health and mental health. So I want to talk about the notion of skills and why are skills important. Let me show you a statistic that was published in Science magazine a few years ago. It's one of many statistics of this type that explains in a very simple, very graphical way how real wages have changed for workers by skill level. I'm using one measure of skill, an important measure, but not the only one, but nonetheless a convenient one. Namely, if you look at the real wages, just indexed by the cost of living, looking at the evolution over time for males, and there's a similar pattern for females, not quite identical, but very similar. If you look at people who have more than a bachelor's degree, you can see that the real wages from 1963 have grown almost uniformly over time. And if you look at the wages of high school dropouts, you can see that actually the wages, at least through 2012, have declined compared to where they were in 1963, and certainly declined from the period in the 60s and the 70s. And you can look at the other skill levels. So skill essentially gives human beings the opportunities out there in the workforce, and the workforce values skills. And if anything, trends in the world economy, trends in technology have shifted more and more towards skills. And the skills are not just the ability to solve math puzzles, although that's important, but also skills that involve social cooperation, learning to get along with others, to control one's emotions. So we've moved, I think, from an understanding, and I'll emphasize this a bit later in the talk, to understanding how broad the variety of skills will be. But if you look at earnings, and you look at particular education and earnings, education and the return to education is a major component of the growth of inequality in the US. It's also true in OECD, most OECD countries as well. So if we want to solve inequality, want to promote social mobility, it's very important that we at least address the question of skills, how to foster those skills, and how to make those skills more equitable. And what's troubling, and I'm not going to show you this in a graph, but even though the return to college or even post-college education has gone up, the actual response in the population has been relatively slow. More people are going to college, but until recently, the actual high school dropout rate in the US was increasing. It was actually increasing. You had, especially for males. For females, not so much. But so what's happened is that there's been a very slow response in the United States. I can't speak specifically for Mississippi, but a very slow response to these opportunities. And the question is, what prevents more children from taking advantage, from attending schools and attending institutions which allow them to essentially benefit from this new market for skills? So that's a huge public policy question. And I want to try to address that question today. But when I talked about skills rather than handouts, I really also want to emphasize a very important point. There is a discussion out there in the population more generally, talking about poverty, and of course poverty is associated generally with a measure of income. But there's also a notion, it goes back to the war on poverty back in the 1960s, that somehow we can reduce inequality and promote intergenerational mobility by providing a more generous welfare and more generous cash transfers. And unfortunately, the record, if you can look at this is the correlation of welfare participation across generation. So if the parent was in mother, usually the mother in welfare is the child in welfare in the next generation. And if you look at various years and look at various birth cohorts, it was true that in the 1960s, when the war on poverty was in full bloom, and early in the 70s, that inequality actually declined. There was just more income redistributed toward the bottom of the distribution. But that redistribution did not give the promise that was given. People wanted to say, give the means, and that will change the next generation. It didn't. And in fact, there's a high degree of persistence, which, if anything, has worsened. Now, it's not strictly a consequence only of the welfare. We know that the labor market has changed, especially for disadvantaged people, unskilled people. I just showed you that. But nonetheless, I think we should think more broadly about what appropriate social policy is. And I think it's a policy that fosters skills. But also, I want to bring into the equation something that is sometimes difficult to talk about, but I think is very important. And that is that we need to think about helping troubled American families to develop the skills of their children. So we want to be able to think about what the state of the American family is and how we can best help American families to produce effective children. So any effective social policy has to go beyond just thinking about schools or just preschool centers. It has to think about reaching out and assisting American families. And many American families, and I'll show you a few statistics, are really in trouble. So what I want to argue is that we can reduce inequality and promote social inclusion and social mobility so that the next generation does better than we do by solving the skills problem. So it's skills, skills, skills. So we need to understand what those skills are and how the most effective ways are to promote those skills. And I want to also argue that what I'm talking about today is rooted soundly in economics. I'm an economist. I'm not a child development psychologist. I am an economist. And everything that I do in this area is trying to understand not only what are efficient programs for producing levels of skill, at lower cost, but also to see what the dollar return is and how these kinds of programs that promote skills compete with other public policy programs, what the rates of return are, and what an appropriate social policy would be. So I think in an era that I hope will go forward, and it certainly was true in American society in the past, that a comprehensive approach would include looking at cost-effective strategies. And that means looking at rates of return and being very hard-nosed about what is effective and what is not effective. But I also want to open up something that is, I think, sometimes neglected. When people talk about these issues of skills, they frequently talk about one aspect of social problems. So there are groups that are focusing mostly on crime and trying to reduce crime. There are others that are trying to promote health, and health is, of course, an important objective. Others are trying to boost test scores or achievement test scores or IQ even, looking at particular measures. But what I want to talk about today is an approach that avoids looking at sort of one problem at a time and looking at these problems when they appear. But I want to suggest an approach that actually addresses multiple problems in an effective way and at early stages in the lives of human beings. So it's a strategy that I would call one more of prevention or really early enrichment than one of remediation. And I think the evidence strongly supports that. Now, what do we know? I mean, in public policy discussions, there is certainly the case that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's a common term, and we know that if there's a problem, people want to solve it. So we see, for example, crime goes up, we say, well, we should hire more police. If in fact we see some issue with health, hire more doctors and so forth. Even with education, hire more teachers, maybe even promote college attendance by better scholarships and so forth. I'm not saying that those are not necessarily effective solutions, but there is a solution, or are solutions that essentially can address multiple problems by the same strategy. And that's one that's based on skills. So let me give you some evidence. This is not evidence from Mississippi. It's not evidence from even the United States. But it's very good evidence on a Western population, and namely those in New Zealand. There is a finding going back to an economist from the late 19th and early 20th century, Pareto, that basically a finding that 20% of the actors account for 80% of the results. That was the claim, that there really are groups of individuals who are concentrated in terms of creating what might be called social problems. And this study in New Zealand followed a cohort of individuals from birth until their early 40s. So it's following the whole lifetime, and it's looking at these children and their families and examining how those families fare and how those individuals fare, and what are the determinants of success. What can we actually say effectively? And so just for one measure, they have multiple measures in their paper. This appeared about a year ago in a new journal, Nature Human Behavior. But what you find is that about 80% of the social welfare benefits paid out to disadvantaged people are paid out to about 20% of the cohort members. And they have a whole variety of statistics. I won't regale you with every one of their statistics, but nonetheless, if you look at problems, social welfare, fatherless children, smoking, excessive weight, hospital stays, prescription fills, injury, crime, it's not always 80%. But the fact is that there is a group of individuals who are contributing. These are the same people. It's not just different people. So these problems, which look like separate problems, really have a common origin. At least we should understand that. And that these problems can actually be addressed by a strategy that boosts skills. So what are the ingredients? Well, if you look at the rest of the cohort, really there are very few in any of these. The cohort is like 30% here, and you see basically very few trace in terms of social benefits. So, and we can look at measures that we can get as early as age 3 and at age 5, when you can accurately measure home environments and so forth. And so these are rough measures: IQ, self-control, socioeconomic status, maltreatment of child. But these are very, very good predictors. And so what we know is that there really is some evidence that, yes, even though the children at age 3 are not really the target of many of the adult social programs, that had we targeted those children in an effective way, many of those costs could have been avoided early on. And so we know what the targets should be. We know how the profiles should actually be constructed. And I just want to suggest how effective strategies could use this kind of information. So I really want to talk about a strategy that's investing more in prevention and much less in remediation. And basically, I think it's a positive approach. So instead of saying we're going to prevent problems, although we are, it's really talking about human flourishing, allowing people to realize their opportunities and to realize those opportunities early in their lives and throughout the course of their lives. So what do we know about success? Well, this is something that economists and others study often. We look at what skills are required for different jobs, and we know that human beings are diverse. We have skills. We pursue our comparative advantage. That's how we can create successful lives. But we also know that those skills can be created. And in fact, one of the modern developments, the one that really is important to understand, was 20, 30 years ago even more recently, and still I would guess today, that many of these skills that we call traits or abilities were viewed as somehow genetically determined. Now, there is a genetic basis, but we also know that these skills can be influenced by beneficial environments. And that's the mechanism, that's the source, which I think is an optimistic way to think about how we can benefit society and where we can effectively intervene. So as I said a minute ago, supporting families and engaging and nurturing children is going to be key to the success of the children in learning and at every stage of the environment. So I think, again, going back, I don't want to pick on Lyndon Johnson or the war on poverty. That was a very bold movement. That was a very bold achievement. Johnson wanted to wipe poverty out in his generation. And it was a time when people didn't understand what we do understand now. Namely, how skills are formed, what the life cycle strategy is, what would be effective. So Johnson thought, well, we can give programs to 60-year-old unemployed steel workers and to 2-year-old, 3-year-old children through Head Start. There was a whole range of programs. It was like a shotgun approach. And so it was well-intentioned, and it was very well evaluated. This is the benefit, I think, of Johnson and the war on poverty, something that people don't much talk about. But in fact, it also created a culture of evaluation, of looking at hard evidence to judge whether or not social policies worked. And so one thing that has emerged from this body of evidence is the importance of the early years, through the kind of phrase that skills beget skills. There's a dynamism here. I mean, there's a natural analogy to trees growing and organisms maturing, but it's not just an analogy. It's an actual reality in the human being when we understand what the dynamics of skill formation are. But we need to understand that the measures that we take of human development should be much broader than are currently constructed in public policy discussion. Much discussion still goes on test scores, NAEP scores, or internationally PISA scores. But we've come to understand, and we've actually measured, that what are called soft skills or character skills are measurable. We can measure them. We can actually base policy on them. There's a lot of active research on that. And that they can be developed. That both IQ, if you want to look at IQ, various aspects of cognition, and character, self-control, they can be developed from conception through birth and into school and career training. So it's important to understand that these are skills. Skills mean they can be shaped. And the notion that somehow people are fixed, that some are born smart, some are born dumb, and there's nothing you can do about it, that is essentially an obsolete point of view. They can be fostered, and multiple skills and abilities actually help solve the problems of economic and social inequality. So what do we know about modern economies? We know, for example, we look at countries around the world, states around the United States, that a skilled workforce is flexible, adaptable, and productive. A workforce actually that can engage in the structure of change in the technology, so that not only knows a particular task, but can adapt to a new task and even develop tasks to a new level, to adjust. These workforces have been the engines that have promoted successful economic development around the world. So this we know. The workforce is very, very powerful. A skilled workforce is a very powerful asset. But we also know that the family is really the cornerstone, the family, not just schools. Family, schools are important, but the family itself is the cornerstone of effective skill development. And yet, what do we know? We know that American family life is under stress. And the challenges facing families impair their ability to foster the skills of their children. So I think this is something that we need to look at. So these are statistics. This is from the United States as a whole. This is looking at trends in the United States about the rise of the number of children under 18 living in a single-parent household. And in case you didn't know this, if you look at single-parent households as a group, not for every single parent in the world, but as a group, these are relatively disadvantaged households. Less income, generally speaking, less education of the mother. The biggest single growth factor has actually been among never married children, among never married mothers. Families where the family life is really threatened, and this is true across the society. Other trends, like there's been an increase in divorce from 1970, but not much. Separation, not so much. Widowed, not so much, if anything, declined. This is a huge factor. And by the way, it's not just in the United States, it's also in many trends around the world. So what happens? These environments are not very supportive for child development as a group. I mean, here in Mississippi, you can also see trends that are sometimes even higher. And you can see that the percent of births to unmarried women is high in the U.S. and even higher in Mississippi. So these questions are not irrelevant. So what do we know about disadvantaged environments as a group? Now, I don't want to say everybody in every environment. That's foolish. But if we look at children who grow up in environments where there is much more disadvantage, the environment to which they're exposed and the learning environment in which they're immersed in their lives differs greatly. This is a study done 20 years ago now by Hart and Risley. It's been replicated in by many other scholars and also in many other countries. But if you look at three groups, they had three groups. This is a group out in Lawrence, Kansas. So they had welfare families, working class families, middle class families, professional families. These were, lawyers and doctors and so forth. And so if you looked at the verbal environment of the children, you see massive differences. So per hour, the number of words that a child hears from a disadvantaged background is roughly close between a third and a fourth of what an advantaged child is hearing. And so that means, and it accumulates. You look at the cumulative vocabulary at age 3, you can see that the initial start, even long before the kids are entering school, those gaps are going to be present. And not only is it a matter of the number of words spoken, it's also the nature of the family environment, encouraging versus discouraging. Look at the difference between affirmatives versus prohibitions. There are different parenting styles. Now, I'm not going to tell people exactly how you should raise your kids, but we do know that these affirmations, these environments which involve attachment and interaction between the parent and the parents and the children are much more affirmative, much more beneficial for child development. So there are some substantial gaps, and those gaps emerge early. And you can also look at achievement test scores, even though I think we should think beyond those scores. If we look at achievement test scores, this is something, again, that's been found in many countries, and it's certainly found in the United States. Here I'm just taking a graph. This is classifying the achievement test scores of children by the education of their mothers. This is just giving you a sense of the disadvantage. So we know that there are a lot of gaps about kids going to college at age 18. If you look at these, and of course these are American data, and the schools are very, very unequal, and these are age standardized scores. But if you go back from 18 down to age 5, you'll see roughly the same gap. This is before the kids enter school. And more or less it's there at age 3. Before age 3, it gets very difficult to measure these things. So when people talk about the gap in college going, and which is partly generated by these achievement test scores, SATs and test ACTs and things like that, those gaps are starting to appear long before people enter school. And I think this is very important. We understand this. Now, somebody could look at this graph and say, oh, this is just genetics. And some people do say that. No, the argument would be very simple, right? Smart mothers go to school, and they have smart kids. But what we do know, and I'll show you some experimental evidence, that we can change these gradients, and we can change these by intervention. So it's not just genetics, and in fact, there's a huge role for intervention. But here's another measure of dimension about how unequal childhoods are getting to be in the United States. If we look at children at the top income quintile, and we look, say, in the year, say, 10 years ago, look at the enrichment expenditures. These are child development expenditures, taking kids to enrich schools, you can see a huge gap that's emerged, actually, from about 40 years ago. And this is a gap that actually promises to promote inequality and maybe reduce social mobility in the next generation. So we know that family environments that adversely affect parenting are the true measure. It's not money. Money is important, it may be important, I'm not denying it, I'm an economist after all. But nonetheless, I think we need to think more deeply about what are the most important ingredients in the life of a child. And I think it's really love and parenting, and I think it's an early family environment. So what I want to argue today and show you some evidence on is how early childhood programs can be very effective in reducing achievement gaps and producing better child outcomes, leading to better skills, more socially beneficial outcomes across the whole life of the child, and to help the society. But the programs that are effective, in my opinion, the most effective programs are those that work with parents and encourage parents. Because the parents, in the end, are the major influence. I was just listening to an interview. There was a terrible story in Chicago recently, just a few days ago, actually, of a mother who was mentally ill, who really already damaged her child, and they were very, very bad. But the head of the Department of Children and Family Services of the state of Illinois was a professional who had worked with disadvantaged children for many years. She pointed out that only in extreme circumstances would you ever want to take a child away from the parent. The love of the parent, the love of the parent, and the love of the mother, even a mother who's not particularly advantaged by certain dimensions, is far more beneficial than any substitute that we can put in its place. So the question is, how can we boost the environment that the child has to work in a voluntary fashion with the parents? And I think what we need is proper measures of what success would be. So I'm going to tell you about a program that actually is relevant. The governor mentioned Head Start. I'll talk about Head Start. People are saying it's not all that effective, although a recent study by HHS was national sample of Head Start actually claimed that Head Start had no effect. And there's a serious problem with that. The serious problem is it was a randomized trial, which has become a religion for some groups in the government. But it was a randomized trial that compared people enrolled in one program, Head Start, with children enrolled in an alternative. And what were those alternatives? Frequently other Head Start programs. So it was comparing sort of apples with apples and saying there's no difference between apples. And it wasn't telling you anything. Head Start itself has been, a whipping boy for many, many years. Years ago, Arthur Jensen started a big controversy using data on another experiment on Head Start that showed no effect. And his experiment actually was replicated later by the Perry experiment that I'm talking about. The goal, remember, the goal of these early programs and the goal of a lot of research about what was effective policy was to boost the IQ of children. IQ is the be-all and the end-all. That was the measure of success. And Jensen pointed out that within a few years, even though Head Start boosted the IQ, by 3 or 4 years after the program finished, the IQs in the treatment group and the control group were no higher. And he said, therefore, you cannot, there's nothing you can do. And that created a whole notion, some people, and that's the genetic argument, going back to the genetic argument. Well, there's another intervention that I've studied, and I've studied it very actively. I'm still studying it. It's gone now, the Perry Preschool program that was launched even before Head Start. This is a program that was it was a random assignment study that enriched the lives of disadvantaged children in a city just outside of Detroit, Michigan. And a control group was formed and a treatment group was formed, and they've been followed over their lives. They're now about 55 years of age. We've studied them over the whole life cycle. And so what did we find? We found exactly like Jensen found, that after a few years from the program, if we looked only at IQ, the program was a failure. And that gave rise to this large controversy, which many people still hold to. And yet, when you looked at the economic benefits of the program, that particular program, looking only at certain dimensions in earnings, crime, and other aspects of social participation, had a rate of return from the initial investment of 7 to 10% per annum. And that's a return that actually includes the cost of raising government funds. So, if you really want to play a very hard-nosed analysis, you say, oh, if you tax people, that creates a certain distortion. This 7 to 10% is after correcting for that distortion. So this is a very high rate of return. It's higher than what you would get from looking at the U.S. stock market over, not recently, but over much of the period, say, between the end of the Second World War and, say, 2005. So that's a pretty good rate of return. And how did it work? What were the main achievements? They're no smarter, at least measured by IQ, but they actually have higher achievement test scores, and they have higher achievements in multiple dimensions. What it did primarily was boost social and emotional skills. It supported parenting, too. There were visits with the parents. And it worked with children in a way that actually integrated them, got them engaged with school. So that's why I say we need good output measures. When we start measuring what schools do, we have to go well beyond the test score literature. Very, very, very limited and actually distorting. I mentioned Arthur Jensen only because he's a particular example. He created a whole literature. The bell curve book is actually a follow-up curve from that book, from Jensen. And again, the idea was genetics are primarily responsible. And yet, you could look between the treatment group children and the control group children, all disadvantaged initially, substantial differences in their lives. So these gaps could be eliminated. And what I found more recently, since these people are now 55, most of them have children. And so in our recent analyses, we found that the next generation actually is also doing very well. So the children of the participants of the children are doing well. So there's a multiplier effect. So it's visiting. They say the sins of the father are visited on to the sons of the next generation. Well, the benefits to the mother are basically accruing for the children across generations. And therefore, we've underestimated what the returns are from these projects. We haven't considered the effects on the lives of the children. There's another program that I think is also, and I know that in Mississippi there's some interest in applying this program. That's the so-called ABC program that was originally developed in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in the 1970s. This program is also widely emulated. Perry is about 30% of Head Start, follow the Perry curriculum. About 40% of Head Start is following a version of ABC. So these are relevant programs, a lot of programs based on it. So what you get when you look at ABC, these people are a little bit younger, but we have followed them now through age 35 with plans of following them to age 45. We looked at one dimension that nobody even thought about. We gave them physicians' visits at age 35. So here, this was a program originally designed to boost IQ. Actually, and it did, by the way. It started very early. Perry started about age 3. The ABC program started about 8 weeks after birth and followed the kids through age 5. And there were actually lasting achievements in IQ. That's another whole story about how early to target various skills. But if you looked at health, nobody even thought, why health? What does this have to do with health? And yet if you look at this, if you look at the blood pressure, the diastolic and systolic, you look at the metabolic syndrome, a precursor for diabetes. If you look at a lot of measures of health, there are significant benefits that accrue to the treatment group. Now, how did that happen? Well, there were physician visits early on in the life of the child. They didn't pay for medicine. They didn't pay for a lot of those health benefits. So what was going on? A lot of this, again, was not only enhanced education and awareness, but social and emotional skills, self-controlled, the ability to kind of follow instructions, to take your medications when the doctor says so, and to lead a healthier lifestyle. So that's one benefit. And here, the rate of return, once you incorporate health, is a very high rate of return. It's over 13.7% per annum. And it's interesting to see, how does the program work? Perry was a few hours a day, 5 days a week for 2 years. That was the dimension. The ABC program was full-day program. It meant also it was a child care program. So it freed mothers to work, and many mothers did work. And so when we looked at the components of what gave rise to this, here's a cost-benefit analysis broken down by general components. The costs are substantial. People say, you know, wait, we have close to $100,000, $80,000, $85,000 in 2014 dollars. A lot of money, people to it. But that's a bad calculation. No economist, nobody who's an efficient planner would say it's just cost. It's cost and return. So if you look at the discounted lifetime benefits, the total benefits, the next column over, you see substantial benefits, huge benefits. And if you look at some of the components, you can see that the children actually, the participants actually had much higher income than the controls. That was a major component. But it also turns out that the mothers had much higher income because the mothers were subsidized to work. The mothers also were subsidized to go back to school, and they themselves are integrated. So what happened is you improve the environment of the child while the child is still at home, and at the same time, the mother, not only in terms of cash, but in terms of having more educated and sufficiently skilled mother in various ways. And you can see then that that is an important dimension. So the child care issue linked with the issue of child development, it was linked very closely here, and you can see the benefits accrue in part. And in fact, it's the case that the enhanced income of the mothers from providing child care pays for the program costs. This is over the course of, so people are worried about delayed benefits. You get immediate payback in the sense of getting more income earned. But if you look at other components, big reduction in crime, but crime alone is not, and reducing all the costs of incarceration, criminal justice system, and improved health. I showed you some of the health readings. So these are multiple dimensions. This is a program that actually then attacks many questions. Problems of working women, adult women with child care issues, on top of the benefits for the next generation. We also know from these programs that low-quality child care programs can actually harm children. That's another thing that has to be kept in mind. Child care and child development have been too often separated, and it's really essential that we understand that high-quality, and actually it turns out that the beneficiaries of high-quality programs, or I should say the victims, so you want to call it, of low quality, turn out to be much more boys than girls. Very sharp gender difference, young boys versus young girls. So what are we saying? The importance of early years, skill begets skill. There's a dynamism of skill formation. This is what we've come to understand. And this has been found in many different aspects, both in economics and in medical fields, for example, in the study of epigenetics, or how environments affect gene expression. And so what you're seeing then is this dynamism. And it follows from a logic that if at each stage in the life cycle, I mean, there's a principle. There's a principle out there that says, you know, those who have higher levels of ability generally benefit more from an intervention. So that sounds like a social Darwinist notion, that we should only help the most beneficial, the most well-endowed, those from advantaged environments. But it misses a key element of human development. The key element of human development is if we improve initial endowments, all down the rest of life, the returns rise from subsequent activity. So it's not just a static notion that, you know, we should help those who are really the most beneficial. So yes, it's true, the rates of return to college for somebody who's very smart and highly motivated can be as high as 20, 25% per annum. But the key difference between that statement by itself and the traditional interpretation is not that all resources should go to the smart at age 20, but to understand that these skills can be formed and that we can benefit from actually each stage of the life cycle by projecting these skills. So what do we know? I've studied a lot. I looked at manpower training programs. I got to wrap up, I guess, pretty soon. So what do we know? I mean, we know when you look at the squeaky wheel, there's a lot of discussion, crime programs, some manpower training programs, that many of these job training programs have not been that effective. And that's saying that all job training programs aren't effective. And there are some ingredients that can be pretty effective, some job search programs. But we know that if you look at rates of return, they're generally much lower, except, ironically, for those who are the most highly motivated and high ability levels, which then takes us right back to the question of how we can make people benefit from those programs. And what I would argue, and if we look very closely at this, is the most effective adolescent remediation programs are targeting social and emotional skills. That we've learned. Now I think we have a very big body of evidence on that. And I would argue that mentoring is just another age-adapted form of parenting. So what I want to argue then, and just in concluding and summarizing the argument, is we want to think about, in going back to Lyndon Johnson and going back to questions of inequality, poverty, and social mobility, that it's not just a matter of redistributing a fixed pot of money. We're talking about creating wealth. And I would argue that what we want to do, at least in part, is to think about what I would call pre-distribution. You'd really want to distribute skills, give children the ingredients and the environments that promote skills, rather than much later when the squeaky wheel is really showing up, trying to avoid the problem at a much later age when it's sometimes extremely inefficient to do so. And so this summarizes the finding, but let me explain what this means. Some people say, oh, you're saying schooling has no return. No, it has a very high return. But the point is, if you do a conceptual experiment and ask the question, if you have the first dollar in the life of a child, where would you invest it? Where would you put it? In the early years or the late years? So the notion would be, should we wait to 18 to invest? No. And why? This is the logic of this whole idea of dynamic complementarity. What you're finding is that the later investments basically build on whatever was accumulated up to that point. The early investments basically create the base that make later investments productive. So this is an out of equilibrium curve, but it's saying the reason why the early investments have such a high return is precisely because they build the base for investment in the later return. So that's a basic piece of economics. You are creating this kind of, you want to call it a Matthew effect, you're giving those kids the advantage, the ability to take advantage of what's offered later in life. So I would say that the returns on high quality programs are documented, and I would argue, contrary to what other people, there are benefits of these programs across the board, but I think it is the case that the highest returns have been found for disadvantaged children. If funds are limited, high quality for disadvantaged children, I think is the most effective ingredient. And of course, you could make programs universal, but I also argue that you, at least from a fiscal point of view, you'd want to make more advantaged families pay for those benefits. So I think what I think is the ingredient here, and I think it's really important to understand, is families are challenged. And in fact, if we look at growing income inequality in the society as it's measured, I mentioned education and skills playing a major role, but another important role is changing family structure. As more single-parent families are out there, creating environments where children are not, as a group, now I'm not saying all single parents, but if you look at the majority, that itself is a major force towards promoting inequality. Now, I'm not saying we should just, force these people to be together or anything of the sort, but I think we should recognize they're challenged and then provide the families with support. So then I would just conclude by talking about proactive steps. I mean, the area is littered with slogans. Too many slogans, and maybe I've given some of these slogans here, so I'm discrediting myself. But I do think it's important, and when you look into these areas, you go beyond the slogans and you question the program, and you look for hard program evidence, really hard program evidence. Not just saying, it's worked a little, for a few years. We really want to look for solid evidence, especially over longer horizons, so we can avoid fade out. And here I'm just offering a couple of websites where you can stay engaged, where there are resources available at this Heckman equation website. And then we have a whole series of new research underway that we make publicly available to other people. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take questions. Okay, oops. Here we go, yeah. Oops.
I am going to open the floor for people who would like to have questions. Go to the floor mic, or if you want to hold up your card, you have people who come around and pick those up. While people are making up their mind what their question may be, Dr. Heckman, I have a question.
Okay.
Or two.
All right.
People who know me know that that's dangerous because it can turn into 20 before long. Here we go. Is that, I'm back on.
Is that on? I think I'm on too. That's not good. Here, one of us should be on. Here, I'll turn me up.
I'm on now. I'm on. Dr. Heckman, you've told us a lot of important pieces of information. What one suggestion would you pass along to the Mississippi Workforce Development Board as a takeaway from your presentation today?
Well, I guess it depends on its perspective, how long-term the vision is. If the idea is to have a skilled and productive workforce in Mississippi in 20 years, and even in the course of time, to support mothers working, to get extra training, to adapt, and to have a children, a new next generation that actually will be enabled to participate and contribute to the Mississippi economy, that I would say that early investment is certainly an important investment, an important option to consider, and to look at the hard evidence against other programs. Compare these rates of return, which I would defend stoutly, against some of the programs that have been tried and failed. I'll be blunt. I mean, one program that many people like is Job Corps. And the evaluations of Job Corps generally have been a failure, showing there not much effect. Short-term gains, not long-term gains. So when you start looking at sort of economic rates of return, that's a hard-nosed way to go about business. But the fact is, like I'm saying, sort of look at solid evidence. The solid evidence on a lot of these job training and retraining programs simply isn't that good. There's a new paper out from the University of Pennsylvania looking at a 10-year evaluation of a job training program using very sophisticated, very interesting methods, essentially a version of random assignment, and showing that the benefits fade after a few years and not showing any benefit. Costly and yet not effective. I worked on the on another program, the Job Training Partnership Act. It was later dropped during the Clinton administration, but that program basically showed no return except maybe for young women, but the rates of return, sometimes it was negative. So I think the fact of the matter is a lot of the skill formation strategies that you read about and that are very popular politically have actually failed. So when I mention this to some colleagues, I say, oh, well, Job Corps is not that effective. They say, oh, this senator or this representative really likes that program, and don't say that publicly. But I honestly think we should say it publicly. And don't forget, I'm not an elected official. I'm not beholden in that sense. And I just think you want to look at good evidence. So I think there is serious evidence. So I would say be evidence-guided and serious evidence-guided, not somebody telling you something that sounds good. Just ask for the numbers. I'll be happy to give anybody the numbers that I used today, or at least you can justify it. We can talk about them. So.
Thank you very much. I think that you gave some good advice. We hope we'll follow it in further discussion. I have one question. that's come from an audience person here. Do you believe that the Great Society has resulted in too high of entitlements that effectively disincentivize an effort to reach out to learn skills in employment when the net cash flow by being employed is, after tax, less than what is received from entitlements? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, we don't have to just look at the Great Society. We can look at a lot of European welfare states. Where, for example, in Norway, in Sweden actually, and in Holland, the disability replacement rate for income was like 113%. So it didn't surprise. Actually, the amazing thing is a lot of people still worked, given those high incentives. But it turned out that the next generation, when they were initially installed, a lot of people didn't work, didn't take the benefit. The next generation did. So I know that from reforms, look at what Denmark did, for example. So again, not the Great Society. So I think it's just basic economics that if you give people incentives not to work, it can be they're going to not work. And there is a high level of, if you look seriously at the level of regulation on hiring a new worker, that's a serious deterrent for a firm. So there really is a sense that, I'm an economist, how can I say otherwise? But the evidence says, indeed, that incentives matter. So in this case, but I think the danger, and I think people have retreated. I think all society, I think Clinton 20 years ago retreated greatly from the Great Society set of programs, with his work requirements and so forth. I think the key that was a failure, nobody really understood it, was that you want to engage people in society. You don't want to isolate them. I mean, that's been found in country after country and program after program. You want to be able to make an inclusive society. And I think work and participating in the larger society is extremely important. And I think it builds skills. We know it does. There's on-the-job training. There's learning by doing. And I think it just makes for a more integrated, socially integrated society to actually engage people and have people working rather than separated. There's a great example in Glasgow, the city of Glasgow. They created a project for what were essentially a group of poor Scottish workers. And they put them out, literally, they took them and they created a project. And Glasgow was a town that was basically building ships and had ports, a lot of activity. They took these people, put them about 10 miles away from town, away from any of the jobs, created a culture which really became pathological. And finally, they just tore it down. And what it did is it created social disengagement. And it created really a pathological society. So I think that those initial efforts, and then maybe they were poorly intentioned at the very beginning to isolate people, but that kind of isolation is just what we don't want. I think we really want engagement. So I would answer it that way.
They tell me if you'll turn your lapel back on and turn that off, and I turn this on, then we can all hear everybody.
I see. Okay. I'm speaking too softly. All right. All right.
I'll do that. Okay, got it?
I think so. No, I don't think I do. Where is it? Wait. It's not moving for me. Right? It's right there. Yeah. You got it? Okay. All right.
Hopefully we won't set off an alarm anywhere.
Okay.
This question, and I apologize, but I will try my best to understand it. This says, I am a retired pediatrician, which may account for my inability to read all of this, but hopefully I can. I'm sorry, whoever you are. How are the families that we want to help best identified, and how do we help them while preserving their dignity?
Exactly. I mean, I think the important thing that we've learned, and I think this is, look, if you start talking down to people or telling them what to do, I mean, it has to be a lot of cultural, social diversity. I think that's one of the most important elements. You recognize the values of the family. You work with those, and you basically give the family information and resources. But you recognize that different families have somewhat different values and respect those values. So I think that's the idea of having not a single curriculum or a unified curriculum, but essentially offering a set of opportunities to the parents and to the family to engage with the children, but on terms that they consider acceptable, whether it's in religious terms or whether or not it's cultural terms. So I think the idea, I mean, for example, in Europe, I'll go back to Europe, trying to be neutral, avoid issues and domestic issues. But for example, in Holland and also in Germany, when there's a very serious, a very substantial population from North Africa now, and also a big population from Turkey earlier. And these populations have their own values. And the idea of creating kind of a unified curriculum for those programs, it simply didn't recognize what values. The parents wanted certain things and didn't. So there has to be some recognition of cultural diversity. I think that's and you work with the parents and take it on their own terms. What is good teaching? In the end, good teaching is personalized education. I mean, it's costly, but it's the best. And it's really then being able to work with the child and the child's family and to kind of respond to what was most effective. That can be very time intensive, and it is time intensive, but it also has high value. So there are ways. In fact, there are whole technologies now in the classroom for doing personalized education, and I think successful programs really do adapt to the family. And the Perry teachers, we brought the Perry teachers together for a reunion, and they worked with individual families. Some were troubled in one dimension, some in another. They basically met with the parents, and they met with the children, and they integrated in the sense of trying to create kind of a common development plan for the children. But it wasn't like there was one size fits all, or that there was a unified approach, or that it even was held necessarily at one center. It could be held in centers that were, cultural centers or religious centers that were separated. So I think you would just want to recognize cultural, social diversity and respect. But you've got to engage the parent. If you got the parent against you, you failed. I mean, you might as well just burn the money. You're not going to do anything. The parents are there, more or less. In most cases, they're there at least 16 hours a day, not counting sleep, and probably 24 hours a day. And even if you send the children to a preschool for a few hours, it's really how the mother responds. There's a program, actually, which I'm fascinated by, and I'm engaged in evaluating it, a program that's in Jamaica. This is a very crude program. And why do I say it's crude? Because ABC was this very elaborate program, $20,000 a year. Educare is even more elaborate. So this program in Jamaica was in the slums of Kingston. And what it did was it actually created an environment where visitors came to the mother once every 2 weeks. And what did they do? They did one thing. They taught the mother how to make a coloring book and interact with the kid. They just engage. Then we follow those kids. We're following them right now. We follow them through age 20, 22, random assignment again. And what it turns out is that the kids who had those engaged mothers doing much better than those who didn't. See, this to me, I mean, again, we don't have yet a study. The kind of Perry and ABC study I have now given you, there are many things going on. So you say, what is it? It's like shooting a shotgun, which pellet killed the bird? You don't know. Here, you've got a pellet, and the pellet is really improving the parent-child, and it's only an hour and a half a week. Amazingly, a version of that was accidentally replicated in Ireland. It was a Preparing for Life program. A former colleague of mine, Orla Doyle, and I'm happy to give you information. It's on this website, but I can give it to you if you're interested. And again, it was a home visit. Like literally, parents were visited like once a month and taught how to engage the child. 5 years, 6 years later, the children are much more engaged, much better in school, especially in social and emotional skills, much more interested in learning and so forth. Now that's only following the kids to age 6. So I think we know that the parents, getting them turned on to the kid is really, and getting that engagement going is, I think, the key. That's my speculation. So.
I have another question that speaks to our demographic. We're very rural, and the question here is, how what would be some of your thoughts on how to do some of these programs or to institute some of the strategies, since we are such a rural state with a few congregated centers of resources?
Well, I mean, that in anything, you go back to what I was talking about, visiting. If you had a visit once a month, you could have visitors traveling around. This actually, I'm engaged with a program in rural China. It's in near Gansu, if anybody knows rural China. It's very, very remote area. And it's essentially rural, and the roads are really almost inaccessible. I mean, you can get around on a Jeep, but you can't really get there any other way. And you can visit families on a case-by-case basis. But if you have a low-intensity program with some mobility of the worker, you can actually reach out in a rural population. That may even be a better case for that. Taking kids into a center could be very costly, especially, and it may even be counterproductive if they're going like an hour or two a day each way. That what I don't think would be just busing the kids in away from their family. So I think that would be one way. This is off the top of my head to do this, and I think. But you see, engaging the family or getting families in the immediate vicinity in these groups that kind of learn how to, just get some advice about how to foster their child's development could be a very effective way in a rural area.
All right, this question has to do with our reality of the states, particularly in our states with others. We must balance the budget annually, and returns that accrue across sectors, and politicians often focus on re-election. So how do we make the case for early childhood investment when sometimes our politicians are looking at a shorter turnaround time than maybe what we could provide them with some of the data like you've shared with us today?
Well, but that's a general issue. If I weren't talking about child development, but I'm talking about developing, for example, information technology that'll pay off in 20 years, you have the same issue of the short budget. But there's another answer, and that is that if you start looking at the benefits, I already showed you here, let me go back to it if I can find it quickly, these benefits that came from an ABC program. You can see that early on in the program, by subsidizing the mother to work, there are real benefits that accrue. And I didn't get all of them. I didn't count, for example, reduced welfare, because that's a transfer. Economically speaking, I'm talking about net benefits to society. But the fact is, there is a distortion. It is implicit when I talk about the tax costs avoided from raising the welfare to pay. But if you get mothers engaged, you're not only getting a more active workforce, but you're also getting benefits quite quickly. Secondly, when children enroll in school, special education has always proved to be very, very costly. It's one of the most costly items. And we know that these programs, when evaluated, have had real effects in reducing special education. So the payoff period is not as short, not as long as what people are saying. But I mean, on the other hand, there really is a sense about taking the long view here. The long view really is I think it's the traditional way. I always think about some of the cases where people have made like major investments, even in a time when there's been a lot of peril, and so we've actually had the long view. We built the Transcontinental Railroad. We built investments on power projects and so forth that had returns that came only years later, but they did have real returns. So I think, but that's another issue. That's an issue. I do believe you're right, or the questioner is right, that there really is a short term, but people claim this also in business investment. So thinking about just what's good for an individual corporation. So there is, and I think this Congressional Budget Office has kind of mandated a payoff period, isn't that right? It's basically 7 years or so for a lot of government projects. And that's a recent development. I mean, when Hoover Dam was built, there wasn't a 7-year payout period, or the Tennessee Valley. And so I think there really is a whole political discussion to be had there about saying we make education. We do accept that education has benefits, but we're not immediately asking the kids to go to work after 2 or 3 years of school. We see long-term benefits, and it's a similar case And so I think you could actually argue it that way. But there are immediate payouts, so there really are. So it's not all a drain. It's not like only 20 years from now will you see anything. You'll start seeing things in the first 5, 6 years.
And this is our final question, unless somebody all of a sudden, I have one more besides this one. Question here is there a place or website or a resource where you could provide us with information? There were a list of most or all of the intervention programs that have been evaluated are located?
Well, there are such programs. There are various activities. I mentioned here at the very last slide here that in terms of this Heckman equation website, there's a lot. We have some very comprehensive surveys of programs, including Head Start, including many other programs that have been tried. And then also new programs that come out, new evaluations. So between those two websites, that's one place. But there are other clearinghouses that provide information on that. What would you suggest, Rich?
Well, I think the Heckman equation is one of the biggest ones. And you did an evaluation of almost all the programs, the federal programs in your early childhood education paper, and that's up on that site.
Yeah, but I'll be happy to provide that if you write me. I can send it to anybody, but it's there at the website. I mean, what we tried to do is put these what we did was actually put these programs in a common metric and ask what were the features of successful programs and what were the features. There are plenty of failures, so it's not like every program that's been launched is good. I mean, the study in Montreal, which was a very low quality child care program that helped working mothers work, but actually ended up causing all kinds of social and emotional problems to the kids, especially the boys. That was, I mean, that's a dud. And I mean, remember, there are several objectives here in society. We're talking about child care, and we're also talking about child development. And so maybe you'll argue, well, the child care is the preeminent issue, so forget about child development. I think that's foolish because I think you can see you get a high return. But nonetheless, I think that's some of the thinking that goes into favoring one aspect over another. It's very hard, too, to monitor and measure quality. There's an awful lot of child care that is not like provided at a center, even a government center. We're talking a lot of a private child care market. And there's a lot of variability in quality. And that's an issue. So it's difficult. I mean, child care costs are extremely expensive, especially for women, single women who have low levels of education. You're talking sometimes 30–40% of the income from a job, making it totally close to totally ineffective to go to work. I mean, you're discouraging people that way from working and gaining skills. So I think the child care issue is a real issue, and I think it has consequences for the child. But you want the quality of the child, too, in the child care to be recognized. And that may be a tricky trade-off, but I think it's valuable to consider it.
Well, I'm glad that you touched on that because everyone received a new brief that the Mississippi Kids Count office just generated around quality of care in Mississippi. So everyone has just gotten that right today, hot off the press. So glad that you
Let me take a
brought
look
that
at
up.
it myself. Yeah.
What did you say? It is funded by Kellogg. That's the.
Okay.
I was supposed to make sure that that was reported according to Dr. South. Two more quick questions because I know we're about to wrap up, and Dr. Musgrove is going to come forward to close us out here in just a moment. In 2010, 62% of pregnancies in Mississippi were unintended. How does this affect childhood development, and is family planning an important part of the parent's skill development?
Well, I think that parents should be aware of birth control. I mean, and of having I wouldn't say just a particular method. I'm talking about have knowledge about how to manage their lives. That's part of what we're talking about. So I think the information should be made available. So if they're unintended, I mean, there's a little danger what an unintended pregnancy is. I mean, what did you mean at that time and so forth? But that's a whole issue. But we do know that at least some of those really do represent ignorance, especially among young children. Now, I think I don't know what it is in Mississippi, but the teenage pregnancy rate has been declining in the U.S. generally. I don't know about here in Mississippi.
I
So-
think we're having some people say that it is on the decline here
yeah.
at the teen level,
The
or
teen level,
age,
yeah.
yes.
And that's generally where we think there's probably the least amount of information going on. But I think, giving people information, letting them use it in their own way, I think is a good thing to do.
Well, I'm going to close out with this final question, which is a very provoking one. The same primary factors adversely influencing the future of youth for employment, such as crime, education, health issues, also adversely impact our national security. In Mississippi, about 82% of our 17 to 24-year-olds cannot even apply for military service due to one or more of those three factors mentioned. Do you see this overall as a national security concern?
Oh, it is. Colin Powell, in particular, has raised this point repeatedly. What did you say the figure was in Mississippi?
82.
82. That's extremely high. In the U.S. at large, it's more like 40%. But it is. I mean, a combination of criminal justice records, criminal system records, criminal records period, obesity, and mental incompetence in the sense of passing the Armed Forces qualifying test. It is an issue that literally a large group of people don't have this opportunity available to them, and so I think it's just an indicator of what's going on in the larger society. I mean, Murray has this book, Charles Murray, which I think is a great book actually, about not the bell curve book. I'm talking more about the book called Coming Apart, and he's really talking about two societies that we're seeing a group of people who are detaching and really becoming kind of alienated from the whole society. This is your 80%, 80%. And then there's the other group, which is fairly elite group, and it shows up in terms of many dimensions: marriage, out of wedlock births, educational attainment. You'll find at the very highest levels of education, highly educated men and highly educated women. If anything, there's more sorting going on positively than ever before. A lot more educated women, a lot of, no question about it. At the bottom, there is much less. A lot of the single parenting and the children without resources are coming from at this bottom, and that group is detaching. That's a serious issue. I mean, and it is something that has to be confronted, and I'm afraid nobody wants to talk about it, but it's there. It's there. And I think one way to promote it is to recognize the problem and to offer resources available. Because most people, most human beings want their children to do better than themselves. And so you can just use that one aspect of human motivation. Give them a lifeline. Help them with their children. Even if they themselves maybe made some mistakes or something. Make sure that the next generation has a chance. I think that's the goal. And I think in that case, it could help in integrating, groups in society. But this coming apart business, I think, is really fearful. I really fear it. It's fearsome development, and I think it leads to a lot of instability, potential instability. So, okay.
Thank you. Thank you,
Okay,
Professor
thank
Heckman.
Whoops. Keep dropping this thing.
I'm Melody Musgrove. I'm co-director of the Graduate Center for the Study of Early Learning at the University of Mississippi. We're delighted that you were here today. And so there we have it, right? That an over 13% annualized return on investment. Where else are you going to get that kind of return, right, on this return on investment for high quality child development programs? Wow, amazing. And we've all heard the saying, you've got to spend money to make money. Right? This is about investing in our future. This is not about today or tomorrow, but this is what kind of Mississippi are we building for our children and our grandchildren. So we really are looking at this, over the long term. And the question always comes up, like, whose responsibility is it, right? And who pays? Those are the questions that always come up, and we believe that it's all of our responsibility, that we can figure this out, that we have to come together, and and I hope that this has not been just another meeting on another day for you, that there's been something here today that will stick with you so that we can figure out how to come together to provide the best future for our children and the best future for the economy of our state. I would be negligent if I didn't say thank you to the staff of the Graduate Center for the Study of Early Learning. They've just been awesome and done a whole lot of work in getting ready for today. our Dean David Rock, who could not be here today, but I believe with us is Dr. Susan McClellan, our Chair of Teacher Education, Dr. Amy Wells Dolan, our Associate Dean. Thank you for being here. Some of the other faculty from the University of Mississippi, thank you. Andrew Abernathy, wherever Andrew went, who is there's Andrew back there. Thank you for all of your help. And of course, the sponsors for today, in addition to the Kellogg Foundation, the North Mississippi Education Consortium. Thank you for being here, Dr. Weeks. Also for the School of Education and Mississippi Kids Count. So thank you for being here today. Dr. Heckman would love to be able to stick around and talk. I know some of you have some questions for him. If you'll send those to us, we'll figure out how to get those questions answered. But he has a private meeting with Governor Bryant, so we're going to have to whisk him off to that meeting. So he's not going to be able to engage as much as he would like to. But thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
All right, we better run.
Oh, better run. Okay.
You need your computer key back. You have other files on it, right?
Yes, I do, but I think I did get it back. I got it back.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, they loaded it.